Your peace, your self-worth, your identity is being slowly chipped away, not by enemies, but often by the very people closest to you. And it happens in such subtle ways that you barely notice until you're filled with resentment, confusion, or exhaustion. Maybe it's the friend who always has something snide to say when you're doing well, or the family member who makes you feel guilty every time you say no. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, believed that what we tolerate shapes who we become. And more dangerously, what we fail to confront within others feeds what we suppress within ourselves. There are certain behaviors, Jung warned, that you should never accept, no matter who it is, not your partner, not your parent, not your oldest friend, not even your spiritual mentor, because the cost of tolerating them isn't just emotional pain, it's the gradual disintegration of your sense of self. Why? Because the psyche doesn't lie. You can pretend you're okay, you can smile and rationalize, but deep within, your unconscious records every insult, every manipulation, every time you silence yourself just to keep the peace. And when that happens often enough, something cracks. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But what if you can't accept yourself because you've been shaped by the things you were too afraid to challenge in others? If you've ever wondered why you feel drained after a conversation, or why you second-guess yourself long after someone else made you feel too sensitive, you're not imagining it. You've been taught to tolerate the intolerable. And today, we're going to explore 6 behaviors Jung would tell you to stop accepting, starting now. Carl Jung didn't just study dreams or symbols. He studied people deeply, painfully, and he understood one fundamental truth. Most people aren't destroyed by trauma that comes from the outside. They're destroyed by what they permit silently, day after day, inside their relationships. So why does this matter today? Because we live in a time where being nice is often more valued than being authentic. You're told to forgive endlessly, to keep the peace, to be the bigger person. But let me ask you this. What happens when your peacekeeping turns into self-betrayal? What happens when the only person you're not allowed to disappoint is the one in the mirror? Jung believed that our unconscious holds on to every act of betrayal we allow, even the small ones. The friend who talks over you in every conversation, the partner who uses "I was just joking" as a shield for passive-aggressive jabs, the boss who guilt-trips you into staying late, again, while calling it team spirit. You shrug it off, right? You tell yourself it's not worth the fight. But slowly, those moments accumulate, and the psyche takes note. Jung called this inner violation a splitting of the self. The more you allow others to step over your boundaries, the more fragmented you become. The result? Anxiety, bitterness, burnout. You stop trusting your own instincts. You start wondering, am I too sensitive? Am I overreacting? No, you're not. You're just feeling the weight of everything you've allowed. And your mind is finally asking you to stop. Think about it. When was the last time you kept quiet just to avoid conflict? When was the last time you left a conversation feeling smaller than when you entered? These aren't harmless interactions. They're soul-deep signals that something is off. Jung didn't give us tools to avoid discomfort. He gave us tools to confront what's hiding in plain sight. So let's bring it into the light. You're about to hear 6 behaviors Carl Jung would say must never be tolerated because they are silent destroyers of identity, clarity, and peace. Let's begin with the first, silent undermining. This is when someone chips away at your confidence quietly, without ever raising their voice or appearing outright hostile. It comes in the form of sarcasm disguised as humor, compliments wrapped in comparison, or subtle dismissals that leave you doubting yourself. You know the tone, "Oh wow, you actually pulled that off," or "That's cute that you think that's a big deal." They don't insult you directly. They don't call you names. They don't explode with anger. No, what they do is worse. They erode you quietly until you start questioning your own worth without even realizing it. Jung believed that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Often, the ones who undermine you are projecting their insecurities. But here's the thing, you're not required to absorb their projections. You might tell yourself they're just joking. You might say, that's just how they are. But why is it always you who has to adjust? Why is it always your confidence that gets stepped on to preserve their ego? Think of the co-worker who always has a correction for your ideas during meetings, even when it's unnecessary. Or the sibling who never celebrates your wins without throwing in, "Yeah, but remember when you messed up that other time? It's death by 1,000 little cuts, and every time you let it slide, you send your unconscious a message. Their voice matters more than mine." Now pause for a second and ask yourself, who in your life makes you feel smaller after spending time with them? Who leaves you overthinking every word you said, wondering if you came off too much, too confident, or too full of yourself? That's not feedback. That's sabotage. Jung warned that tolerating this kind of behavior not only drains your energy, it trains you to distrust your own instincts. And once you stop believing in your own voice, you start depending on theirs. Don't let that happen. Silent undermining is a betrayal in disguise, and if you continue to allow it, you become complicit in the erosion of your own potential. Now, let's move to the second behavior Jung would never advise you to tolerate: emotional blackmail. This one is trickier because it often comes wrapped in affection, guilt, or concern. It sounds like love, but it's really control. Emotional blackmail is when someone uses your feelings against you, your loyalty, your empathy, your fear of abandonment, to manipulate your choices. And the manipulation is never loud. It's not, "Do what I say or else." It's more like, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me?" Or, "If you really cared, you'd already know what I need." That quiet guilt, that pull on your heartstrings, is how they get you to surrender your boundaries without ever raising their voice. Jung understood that guilt, when misused, becomes a psychological weapon. He believed that unresolved guilt pulls us into patterns of submission, not because we're weak, but because we're unconsciously seeking redemption from people who never deserve that kind of power. Let's ground this in something real. Imagine you're finally taking time to focus on yourself, going back to school, building your career, or just setting firmer boundaries. Then suddenly, your partner starts getting distant. They don't argue, they sulk. They make offhand comments like, "I guess you're too busy for us now." And without ever asking you directly to stop what you're doing, they make you feel bad for doing it. Before long, you start scaling back, skipping class, cancelling plans, all just to restore their comfort. But at what cost? Here's the deeper truth. Any love that asks you to shrink yourself is not love, it's control. Ask yourself, when someone expresses pain, do you automatically feel responsible for fixing it, even when it's not your fault? Do you constantly second-guess decisions because someone close to you might get upset, even if you've done nothing wrong? That's emotional blackmail at work. It thrives in relationships where love is confused with sacrifice. But Jung made it clear, true connection honors freedom. It invites wholeness, not obedience. If someone only values you when you're bending for them, then what they value isn't you, it's your compliance. It's not your job to carry someone else's insecurity, especially when it's weaponized to keep you from growing. Now, let's talk about something even more deceptive: kindness as gaslighting. This is the third behavior Jung would want you to watch for and refuse. At first glance, it doesn't look toxic at all. In fact, it looks generous, supportive, thoughtful, but underneath, it's a form of manipulation that confuses your reality and reshapes your truth. You've probably heard this before, "But I was only trying to help," or "I'm doing this for your own good." These statements often come from people who cloak control in concern. They question your choices, your instincts, your goals, but not with open hostility, with sweetness, with a soft tone, with a smile. And slowly, you begin to question yourself. Jung warned us that one of the most dangerous things we can do is abandon our inner truth in exchange for harmony with someone else's version of what's best. And that's exactly how kindness as gaslighting works. It convinces you to doubt your path, not through force, but through love. Imagine a friend who constantly talks you out of your goals. You say you're thinking about quitting your job and starting your own business. They smile and say, "Well, I just don't want you to get your hopes up. You've always struggled with follow-through." Or you tell your partner you want to take a solo trip to reset your mind, and they respond with, "I mean, if you really think that's safe. But if something happens to you, I don't know what I'd do." You walk away thinking they were just being caring, but if you look closer, you'll see what's happening. They're creating doubt, so you'll stay where they're comfortable keeping you. And here's the question you need to ask yourself. How many of your choices are truly yours? And how many are filtered through someone else's approval, masked as concern? This kind of behavior is hard to call out because it doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like protection, but protection that limits you is not protection. It's control in disguise. Jung believed that self-realization, the process of becoming who you really are, requires breaking free from false kindness, because not every smile is safe, not every soft word has good intentions. True support empowers you, even when it disagrees with you. It doesn't leave you second-guessing yourself at every step. So if someone constantly means well, but you always leave the conversation doubting yourself, ask yourself why. Because now we're stepping into a closely related but distinct behavior. Guilt-driven boundary crossings. The fourth behavior Carl Jung would tell you to stop tolerating. This one can feel almost invisible at first because it often plays on your deepest values, your loyalty, your compassion, your desire to be a good person. It happens when someone repeatedly crosses your boundaries, not out of malice, but because they've learned how to twist guilt into a tool. Jung taught that unresolved guilt, especially when manipulated by others, disconnects us from the self. And once you lose that connection, you stop setting limits, not just for others, but for yourself. You give until you collapse. You stay silent to avoid hurting feelings. You put their comfort above your well-being because you're afraid of being seen as selfish, ungrateful, or uncaring. But who defined those terms for you? Let's get real for a second. You finally take a weekend for yourself. No calls, no visits, just rest. And suddenly, a family member says, "Wow, must be nice to have time to ignore everyone." You set a healthy boundary with a friend, maybe about your space, your availability, or even your emotional bandwidth, and they hit you with, "So, I guess I don't matter anymore." You're not being rude, you're protecting your peace, but they make you feel like a villain for doing it. And here's the deeper trick. These guilt-driven boundary crossers often don't ask directly. They imply, they hint, they sigh dramatically. They make you feel the emotional consequences without ever saying what they want. So you fold, you cave, you let them back in, not because it's right, but because it's easier than feeling guilty. But easy isn't always healthy. Jung believed in something radical, that guilt isn't always a sign of wrongdoing. Sometimes it's just a sign that you're healing from people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. So let me ask you, how many times have you said yes just to avoid feeling guilty? How many times have you apologized for simply having a need? If you're constantly reshaping your life to avoid someone else's emotional reactions, then that's not love. That's emotional entanglement. And Jung would argue that it fractures the unity of the psyche, forcing your authentic self to go underground, while the version that keeps the peace takes its place. But the truth is, any peace that comes at the cost of your integrity isn't peace. It's quiet suffering. Now let's move into something that many of us have experienced but don't always know how to name: chronic ghosting. This is the fifth behavior Carl Jung would warn you never to tolerate, no matter how normal it might seem in today's world. Chronic ghosting isn't just about disappearing after a date or going silent in a text thread. It's a deeper, more damaging pattern where someone repeatedly withdraws from you, emotionally or physically, whenever things get uncomfortable, vulnerable, or real. It's the friend who vanishes whenever you need them, only to resurface when they want something. It's the parent who shuts down emotionally when you bring up how their behavior hurt you. It's the romantic partner who disappears after an argument and refuses to communicate, leaving you in emotional limbo, wondering what went wrong and what you did to deserve it. Jung spoke about the psychological shadow, the part of the self that contains what we repress, deny, or avoid. Chronic ghosting is often a symptom of someone refusing to face their own shadow. They escape accountability, they dodge emotional depth, and worst of all, they leave you carrying the weight of their avoidance. But here's the cost to you. When someone ghosts you repeatedly, it creates a wound that feels personal. You start internalizing their absence as your inadequacy. You overanalyze your last message, your tone, your timing. You start asking, did I come on too strong? Was I too emotional, too needy? But that's the trap. Their behavior becomes your burden. Jung believed that clarity is a sign of inner wholeness. A mature psyche confronts discomfort. It doesn't run. It doesn't disappear. So when someone makes a habit of vanishing the moment intimacy or truth shows up, they're not just being immature, they're being harmful. And you are not required to keep chasing someone who keeps choosing silence over honesty. Let's be honest. How many times have you let someone back into your life just because they finally decided to reply, as if their absence didn't cause you emotional confusion? How many times have you made excuses for someone who disappears and reappears at their convenience? That inconsistency isn't harmless. It's a psychological toxin. It teaches you to expect abandonment, to get comfortable with half-love, to crave breadcrumbs instead of full presence. But Jung would tell you, the soul cannot thrive where the truth is always running. If someone can't offer you stability, clarity, or accountability, then you have every right not to chase, but to walk away, not with anger, but with awareness. And that same awareness is exactly what you need to recognize this sixth behavior: patronizing advice. Giving. It might sound harmless, even helpful, but Jung would tell you this is one of the most subtle forms of control and ego inflation, and it should never be tolerated. This is when someone consistently positions themselves as wiser, more capable, or more enlightened than you, even when you never asked for their input. Their advice isn't offered with humility, it's offered with condescension. And it's often disguised as concern or just trying to help, but the undertone always feels the same. They know better, you don't. Think about it. Have you ever shared a personal struggle only to be met with a smug "you should have done this instead," or mentioned a new idea you're excited about and someone jumps in with "that's not how the real world works"? Maybe you've even been vulnerable and instead of support, you got a lecture, a calm but cold reminder that they've already been there, done that, and apparently done it better. Carl Jung believed that true growth happens in relationships where both people are seen as equals, not where one constantly assumes the role of the savior, the teacher, or the guide. When someone always positions themselves above you, it doesn't build connection, it builds hierarchy, and it subtly conditions you to second-guess your inner voice. This kind of behavior is especially common in families, workplaces, and even friendships masked as mentorships. An older sibling who constantly interrupts you with, "Let me tell you how it really is." A colleague who rewords every idea you share in meetings to make it sound like theirs, then says they're just polishing your thoughts. Or even a partner who treats your dreams like they're cute little distractions from reality. And what happens over time? You stop speaking up, you hesitate before sharing, you start seeking permission instead of trusting your own insight. Jung would remind you that when someone gives advice without being invited to and does so in a way that makes you feel small or naive, what they're really doing is feeding their own unconscious superiority complex. It's not about you, it's about their need to feel in control, in the know and above. But here's the truth. You don't need to be fixed. You need to be heard. So ask yourself, are there people in your life who only show up to correct you, not connect with you? Do you leave conversations feeling enlightened or belittled? You don't have to accept advice that strips you of agency. You're allowed to say, I'm not looking for a solution. I just needed space to feel what I'm feeling. You're allowed to trust your own process, even when others don't. But what happens when you don't? What happens when you consistently allow these 6 behaviors, silent undermining, emotional blackmail, kindness used to confuse, guilt-driven boundary crossing, chronic ghosting, and patronizing advice, to go unchecked? That's where the real damage begins, because the danger isn't just in what others are doing, it's in what you're slowly becoming in response. Carl Jung believed that the psyche is not a machine, it's an ecosystem, and like any living system, it gets sick when its balance is disturbed. Every time you silence your truth to avoid confrontation, every time you shrink to keep someone else comfortable, every time you absorb blame that doesn't belong to you, you fracture that system. You stop expressing your needs clearly. You stop trusting your emotions. You stop recognizing your own voice. And instead, you begin living in reaction to others, always scanning for approval, validation, or signs that you're good enough to avoid being rejected or corrected. And this is how the false self is born. Jung called it the persona, the mask you wear to adapt and survive. But the longer you wear that mask, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before you needed it, until one day you realize you don't even know what you want anymore. Only what keeps the peace, what earns affection, what avoids disappointment. But is that living or is it performing? Jung once said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you can't do that while tolerating behaviors that suppress, belittle, or manipulate you. Because each time you allow them, you make a silent agreement with your unconscious. This is okay. And your unconscious listens. It records every compromise. That's why it feels like anxiety, why it shows up as chronic fatigue, why you overthink every decision and feel guilty for simply choosing yourself. These aren't personality flaws, they're symptoms of a psyche asking for rescue. So ask yourself, what have you tolerated for so long that it started to feel normal? Who have you become just to be accepted? And more importantly, are you willing to stop? Because healing doesn't start with other people changing. It starts when you stop making excuses for why they don't have to. But once you see these behaviors clearly, what then? How do you begin the process of reclaiming your power without becoming cold, angry, or detached? Jung didn't just want us to see the problem, he wanted us to transform through it. That transformation begins with one thing: boundaries, and not the loud, defensive kind. Real boundaries are quiet, calm, and consistent. They're not about control, they're about clarity. They tell people who you are, what you value, and what you will and will not accept. So here's a simple yet powerful 3-step boundary toolkit to help you deal with these 6 behaviors when they show up in your life. Step 1. Name it. Call the behavior what it is. First to yourself, then, if necessary, to the person involved. This doesn't mean accusing or attacking. It means acknowledging your reality. Let's say your friend constantly makes jokes that cut deep. Instead of brushing it off, you say, when you make those comments, it doesn't feel like a joke to me. It feels like I'm being disrespected. That's naming it. You're not debating whether they meant it that way. You're naming how it lands. Because when you name it, you take it out of the shadow and into the light. And Jung taught us that what we bring into the light, we can begin to heal. Step 2. Claim your limit. This is where you clarify your line. And this is not about asking permission. It's about stating your position. For example, I'm not okay with conversations that leave me feeling attacked. If that continues, I'll have to take a step back. You're not threatening, you're setting a condition for your peace. You're saying, I matter too. You don't need to over-explain, over-apologize, or convince them that your feelings are valid. Your limit is not a debate, it's a declaration. Step 3. Reinforce with action. This is the part many people struggle with because it's easy to set boundaries, it's hard to enforce them. But if you set a boundary and then backtrack when tested, you're teaching others that your limits are optional. Let's say someone ghosted you for weeks, then pops back in like nothing happened. You don't need to argue or guilt trip. You simply say, disappearing like that doesn't work for me. If we're going to keep this connection, it needs to be mutual. If not, I'm moving on. And then you follow through. Not to punish, but to protect your peace. Ask yourself, how many boundaries have you communicated but never followed through on? How many times have you hoped someone would get it, even though your actions said, it's fine, I'll let it slide again? So let's be honest for a moment. How many of these 6 behaviors have you quietly tolerated, hoping they'd change? How many times have you made yourself small just to keep someone else from feeling uncomfortable? How often have you kept peace on the outside while screaming on the inside? That's not balance, that's bondage. So now it's your turn. Take a breath. Think back to the behavior that hit you the hardest. Was it the subtle undermining, the emotional guilt, the silence that followed your vulnerability, or the advice that always made you feel smaller? Whatever it was, start there. Write it down, reflect on how it's shown up, and then decide what boundary you need to set, even if your voice shakes when you say it. Because you deserve relationships that don't require you to disappear in order to be loved. And if this message resonated with you, share it. Not just the video, but the awareness. Start the conversation, break the cycle, and most importantly, drop a comment below with the one behavior you're finally ready to stop tolerating. Because the moment you decide that your peace is non-negotiable, that's the moment your healing truly begins.